I spoke to U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She joined us from Capitol Hill. I began by asking her the reasons behind this mass release.
Well, I'm very pleased that the administration really is beginning to, quite frankly, really recognize that there's some very deep, extreme injustices in our criminal justice system, especially as it relates to those who were incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses. And so what this administration is doing is what many of us have been asking for many years, and that is to begin to look at rehabilitation and reentry and providing for a second chance for those who have committed especially nonviolent drug offenses. And so this is just the beginning. Hopefully we'll be able to find the resources to make sure that the educational resources that are there, that the type of support services are there, and that we help find formerly incarcerated individuals the workforce training and the jobs that they need so they can move on with their lives.
As you say, there are some deep injustices in the system, but does this prisoner release have to do with fair play and justice, or is it about cutting the cost of keeping people in prison?
Well, some would say it's about cutting the cost. Some would say it's about fair play and about justice. Whatever you believe, the point is we have to have a criminal justice system that is just that, a criminal justice system. And so we have to figure out ways to provide alternatives to incarceration, especially for nonviolent offenses, and come up with some kind of fair sentencing guidelines that really do not allow for the mass incarceration of especially African American and Latino men, which we have seen over the last few decades, really, over the last 20 years.
How does this prisoner release system work? I mean, who's responsible? Is it the White House, and then there is a federal agency called the U.S. Sentencing Commission? There's yet another federal agency called the Bureau of Prisons. Who's responsible?
Well, you know, all parties have a part in this whole effort. The Department of Justice and the White House, they've established a policy, and they have to work with local communities and the states to figure out what those reentry plans are. And so everyone has a part of this. We have to fund at the congressional level, and I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We have to make sure that the federal resources are there for these reentry efforts.
The United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. How did it get to this?
Well, it's outrageous, quite frankly. It's immoral, it's wrong, it's unethical. And I call your attention to Michelle Alexander's very detailed book, The New Jim Crow. It's about mass incarceration. It's about the war on drugs. This goes back really to the Reagan administration. Unfortunately, some of the crime bill, which President Bill Clinton initiated, signed, and promoted, included provisions that really increase sentences. And so this has been historical. It's been a terrible travesty of justice, and thank goodness this administration is beginning to really understand that something must be done. But when you look at mass incarceration, that's real. It's real in every state in the country, and it's been unfair, and this has nothing to do with regard to violent criminals who need to be put in jail. I mean, we're talking about increase in public safety by ensuring that people have a second chance who were incarcerated unfairly. The criminal justice system, when you look at people who are poor, people who are low income, they didn't have access to good lawyers. You know, oftentimes they plea bargain cases based on advice to do that up front. Many low-income people didn't have really the money to pay for good representation, and so this is very complicated, and we have to begin to unravel this, and I hope everyone in my district especially understands that this is something we all have to pull together on and have to work on.
Right, and here's another startling figure. I mean, you mentioned this a moment ago. African Americans make up 12 to 13% of the U.S. population, yet they make up 60% of the country's prison population. African Americans, we know, are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white people are.
Well,
How do you explain that?
unfortunately, racism is still alive and well. You have structural racism, you have institutional racism, you have policies that stem from many, many, many years ago, the legacy of slavery. Once again, this is the new Jim Crow. There have been barriers that have been put up for people. Unfortunately, they've been targeted in many respects to African Americans and people of color. And this is a glaring example of why we have to talk about race and racial justice, because race is still a factor in our everyday life in America, and the sooner we come to grips with that being a factor, not the only factor, but race is a factor, then the quicker we can move on and make this a stronger country, because everyone deserves an equal opportunity at the American dream, and that has not happened in this country for African Americans and for Latinos. That's just a fact. You look at the criminal justice statistics.
Now, right now, the country is saddled with these mandatory minimum sentences. What is Congress doing about changing that?
Well, we have several bills that are pending, one by some great leaders in the House, Congressman Bobby Scott, Congressman John Conyers, of course, Congressman, I believe Sensenbrenner is working on the House bill that would help reduce these mandatory minimums. Right now, just look at what's happening as it relates to crack cocaine. Formerly, it had been 100 to 1. Now it's 18 to 1. Well, it needs to be 1 to 1. And so there are so many different policies such as that legislation is going to be necessary to get this done. So hopefully we can find more bipartisan support, more Republicans to support these bills, because the time is right now to create some justice in this criminal justice system.
Right, of course, releasing prisoners are one thing. The other challenge is to reintegrate prisoners into mainstream society. Many of these prisoners, the average length of prison time they've served is 9 years. They're going to have to be reintroduced to society right now. For many of them, it's very hard to do that. Let's listen to one prisoner who's been released and hear what she has to say.
One of the hardest obstacles I had to overcome was figuring out how to use a computer in this modern technology age, traversing the internet, and I was at DMV and it was telling me to touch the screen. I can't remember if I didn't touch it in the right place or touched it too hard or not hard enough, and I'm trying to get this machine to start and not knowing what I should do. It could be scary for a lot of people.
So what is being done to rehabilitate people?
Well, part of what the president's proposal includes is to make sure that formerly incarcerated individuals receive the type of training in terms of workforce training and in terms of technology training, because you can just hear the frustration in this young lady's voice. I mean, this is a different world out here. In 9 years, a lot has changed, and so I think the administration is on the right track. We here in Congress are working again, I'm an appropriator, and so I try to put as much money and federal funds into workforce training, into tech training for those who have been incarcerated. And so this is a heavy lift, but we have to lift people up and help with reentry and make sure that they are able to move on with their lives. Also, when you look at the fact that there are lifetime bans for drug offenses as it relates to Pell Grants, as it relates to public housing, as it relates to food stamps, when formerly incarcerated individuals reenter into society, there's a lifetime ban. They're ineligible for these federal benefits, which help get over the troubled waters that they have to get over as they reenter. So we're trying now to find some legislative fixes where we can remove just those barriers, which would be tremendous. Also, ban the box. I wrote a letter to the president. We had over 70 members of Congress sign it, and we want federal contractors and federal agencies to ban the box in terms of the questions as it relates to prior history in terms of being in prison or in jail. Those questions aren't necessary if, in fact, people pay their dues to society. They've done their time. They need to get out of jail now and find a job. And so banning the box is extremely important. That would provide an economic opportunity for those who have been incarcerated to move on, take care of their families and their children, and hopefully live the American dream.
And when we look at these high rates of incarceration, to what extent is there a link between the high prison population and privatized prisons? We know that, privatized prisons can only survive, can only make a profit if there are prisoners. And we know that these companies have a lot of friends in Congress as well.
Well, there's a link. You just look at California's prison population. I was in the California legislature for 7 years. I was in the Assembly and the Senate. I was on the Public Safety Committee, and sentence enhancements continued to come before this committee, and of course I voted against them. But when you looked, I remember one discussion when we looked at sentence enhancements, and it was about building new prisons. And I asked, like, who are these prisons for? And these are for kids who are in kindergarten. They're building them 12 years out because we just know there's going to be this prison population. Rather than that, I said we should put more money into universal preschool, into early childhood education, into child development, instead of building prisons for kids who were then in kindergarten. That was outrageous. And so there is a prison industrial complex, and we have to crack this pipeline from the cradle to prison.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.